April 1945. The air heavy with the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke hangs over the war-torn landscape of Germany. The relentless rumble of tank treads fills the otherwise tense silence. Black soldiers from the 761st Tank Battalion, their uniforms grimy with dirt and their faces hardened by the horrors of battle, advance through the crumbling ruins of a once proud city. Their mission is clear: to eliminate the last pockets of Nazi resistance and bring an end to the tyranny that has scarred Europe. But for these soldiers, this is no ordinary mission. It is personal. They are not just fighting to liberate a continent. They are fighting to prove something deeper: their dignity, their worth, and their humanity. As the sounds of the battlefield echo around them, the 761st soldiers remember the racism and discrimination they have endured, not just from the enemy they now face, but from their own country. The memory of being treated as second-class citizens back home lingers in their minds. But now on the front lines, they stand ready to face those who, like the Nazis, believed in racial superiority, believing that these soldiers, too, were inferior. As they approach a German stronghold, the soldiers are met with the stunned resistance of Nazi soldiers who, like the soldiers themselves, had been taught that the black American soldier was not a real threat. The 761st soldiers show no mercy. With fierce determination and a sense of justice, they strike, fighting not just for victory but for every slight, every injustice, every year of segregation they have endured. For these men, the battle is as much about proving their worth as it is about defeating the enemy. They show no mercy, not because of hatred, but because they are finally in a position to take the justice that had long been denied to them. April 1945 marked a critical turning point in World War II, with the Allied forces closing in on Germany from all sides. The Nazis, once the dominant force across Europe, were now retreating. Adolf Hitler's regime was crumbling, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was fighting a desperate, losing battle. But in these final months of the war, while the Allied forces surged forward, they did not march alone. Alongside them were the African American soldiers of the United States Army, units that had long been relegated to segregated units and relegated to non-combat roles until necessity forced the military to allow them to fight. Among these African American units was the 761st Tank Battalion, a unit formed in 1942 as part of the U.S. 12th Armored Division. The 761st, nicknamed the Black Panthers, were the first African American tank unit to see combat during the war. Their involvement in the war was not only a fight against Nazi Germany, but also a battle against racial prejudice within their own ranks. They were soldiers who had been fighting for freedom and equality abroad, while at the same time being denied those very same freedoms at home, in the United States. The irony of the situation was not lost on the men of the 761st. They were tasked with fighting for a country that had long denied them full rights and opportunities. While the nation they fought for espoused freedom and democracy, African Americans in the military were segregated and subjected to systematic racism. The military was no different from American society as a whole. Black soldiers were often relegated to subpar roles, denied leadership positions, and treated as inferior by their white counterparts. Yet when the United States entered the war and the need for soldiers became critical, the 761st Tank Battalion was formed, and the men of this unit found themselves on the front lines in Europe, fighting not just for victory, but for a place in history. As the 761st and other African American units advanced through France and into Germany, they faced both the brutality of the Nazis and the specter of racism in their own military. But it was in these harsh conditions that the black soldiers of the 761st began to carve out their place in the war's legacy, not only as skilled combatants, but also as men of character, able to rise above the discrimination they faced to become some of the most effective and respected soldiers in the Allied forces. Meanwhile, the Nazi regime in its final days was clinging to its ideology of racial superiority, which had been a cornerstone of its policies. Under Hitler's vision, the Aryan race was viewed as the pinnacle of humanity, and all other races were deemed inferior, including Jews, Slavs, and people of African descent. For the Nazis, the idea that black soldiers could stand as equals in combat was both a physical and ideological affront. But the 761st Tank Battalion and their fellow African American soldiers fought back against that very ideology with every tank they maneuvered, every battle they won, and every step they took on European soil. As the Allies pushed through Germany in early 1945, the 761st became an unstoppable force, proving not only their value on the battlefield, but also challenging the racial prejudices they had long faced. Yet for these men, victory was not just about defeating the Nazis. It was about proving to the world that they were equal in every sense. Their fight against the Nazis became a fight for their own dignity and recognition, and every battle they fought was a battle against the racial injustice they had experienced for so long. The Nazis' racial ideology was rooted in the belief of Aryan racial superiority. With the Wehrmacht, the unified armed forces of Nazi Germany, proudly upholding this ideology through their tactics, policies, and even their treatment of prisoners, the Nazis made no distinction between the various ethnic groups they targeted, and their treatment of non-Aryans was brutally systematic. Jews, Slavs, Romani people, and even black soldiers were viewed as racially inferior by the regime, with Hitler and his followers believing that these groups posed a direct threat to the purity of the Aryan race. For the black soldiers of the 761st, this belief in racial inferiority was not just abstract, it was personal. The very men they were fighting against held deep, entrenched racial prejudice against them. The Nazis saw no distinction between the black soldiers of the 761st and the oppressed peoples of Europe they had subjugated for years. These soldiers, who had been subjected to racial discrimination in the United States, now faced the full force of Nazi hatred. The German soldiers, conditioned by Nazi ideology, likely underestimated the African American soldiers they faced. They viewed these men not as equals, but as inferior beings unworthy of respect. The 761st knew that the Nazis held no illusions about their abilities. They saw them as nothing more than a nuisance in their path. But the black soldiers of the 761st were not there to prove themselves to the Nazis. They were there to fight, to protect, and perhaps most importantly, to show the world that their fight for equality and recognition would not be denied. The encounter between the 761st and the Nazis was thus more than just a military clash. It was a battle for pride, for dignity, and for revenge against an enemy that had long upheld the same racist ideologies that had oppressed African Americans both in the United States and across the world. The 761st Tank Battalion was composed of men who had fought for their country abroad, only to face oppression at home. For these black soldiers, every battle fought in Europe carried with it the weight of their personal history. They were not only fighting to defeat the Nazis, but they were also fighting against the racial prejudices they had endured in the United States, a country that had systematically denied them the freedoms they were now risking their lives to protect. The emotional impact of this dual struggle, fighting a foreign enemy while confronting the racial oppression within their own ranks, was profound. The black soldiers had long been relegated to secondary roles in the military, and many had to fight for the right to even be considered for combat positions. Despite their proven abilities, they were still treated as inferior soldiers by their white counterparts and superiors. But now, standing on the battlefield in Germany, they faced an enemy that, like their own nation, viewed them as less than human. For the black soldiers, the battle against the Nazis was deeply personal. The Nazis' racial ideology, which had been built upon the same foundation of white supremacy that they had fought against in the U.S., represented an affront to everything these men had stood for. The thought of taking revenge against the Nazis was tempting, after all. These were the same individuals who had lived with racial prejudice every day, who had been subjected to systemic discrimination at home and abroad. In some ways, the 761st soldiers' willingness to show no mercy to the Nazis was not just about military strategy. It was a way to confront the same racial injustices they had endured for so long. The emotional toll of this experience was not lost on the soldiers. It was more than just an opportunity for revenge. It was a moment of empowerment. The ability to fight back, to defend not only their country but also their honor, was a cathartic release for men who had long been denied the right to fight for their own dignity. The Nazis, who viewed them as inferior, now faced the consequences of their ideology. The act of showing no mercy was not just about military victory, but also about reclaiming a sense of self-worth that had been denied for so long. The 761st Tank Battalion, despite facing racial prejudice within their own ranks and having limited resources compared to their white counterparts, demonstrated extraordinary skill and effectiveness on the battlefield. These men fought with a sense of duty that transcended traditional military objectives. Their fight was not just about defeating the Nazis. It was also about proving their worth as soldiers, as equal members of the military and as men. In terms of military strategy, the 761st was fully integrated into the U.S. 12th Armored Division during the war. Their tanks, part of the Sherman Tank Brigade, were among the best equipped in the Allied forces. The battalion quickly became known for their efficiency in battle, despite facing numerous challenges, including a lack of proper supplies, segregated living conditions, and constant prejudice from other soldiers. Yet, when they encountered Nazi forces, their tactics were ruthless and precise. The black soldiers fought with a sense of moral righteousness, their anger against the Nazis' ideology of racial superiority, giving them an additional sense of purpose. The 761st soldiers weren't just aiming to win battles. They were aiming to prove that their abilities in combat matched, if not exceeded, those of their white counterparts. Their effectiveness in battle also stemmed from the emotional fuel of their personal history. The Nazis, who had been indoctrinated into an ideology of racial supremacy, underestimated their enemies. But the black soldiers were determined to prove that their value as soldiers was not determined by the color of their skin. The battle strategies of the 761st were rooted in their resilience and experience. They had trained hard and fought under extreme circumstances, and their ability to perform under pressure reflected their commitment to the mission. Every victory they achieved, whether in the Battle of the Bulge or in their relentless pursuit of German strongholds, carried with it the added weight of personal pride. Each battle fought was a chance to demonstrate their tactical superiority and to refute the racism they had faced for so long. For the Nazis, who were accustomed to the idea of racial superiority, the sight of black soldiers showing them no mercy in battle must have been a rude awakening. These men were not just fighting with military strategy, they were fighting with a profound sense of justice and moral clarity, which gave them an edge. In the end, the 761st Tank Battalion demonstrated that their worth was not defined by their race, but by their tactical excellence and their dedication to their cause. In any war, the equipment at a soldier's disposal plays a crucial role in their ability to succeed on the battlefield. For the 761st Tank Battalion, the technology and material resources available to them were both an asset and a challenge. Despite being an elite unit on the front lines, African American soldiers were often given inferior resources compared to their white counterparts. The military hierarchy, steeped in racial prejudice, viewed black soldiers as less capable, and as a result, they were sometimes denied the latest or best equipment. Yet despite these challenges, the 761st soldiers proved their worth, demonstrating that their skill and determination could overcome even the most difficult odds. The Sherman tanks, which were the primary weapon in the 761st's arsenal, were formidable on the battlefield. Though not as technologically advanced as some of the German tanks they faced, the Sherman was highly effective. In the hands of the experienced tank crews of the 761st, these tanks were equipped with powerful 75mm guns and a reliable chassis that allowed them to move quickly across a variety of terrains, critical in the push across France and into Germany. However, the 761st soldiers were not given the best tanks. Their Shermans were often older models, with less efficient engines and armor compared to the latest tanks used by other units. Yet despite this, the Black Panthers proved their capability. They adapted quickly, using the terrain and their tactical knowledge to exploit the weaknesses of their enemies. In the face of superior German technology, they used ingenuity and experience to gain the upper hand. The battlefield, filled with the rumble of tanks, the clatter of machine guns, and the explosion of artillery, was a place where the 761st soldiers demonstrated their technical expertise. Their tanks, though sometimes outdated, became symbols of their perseverance. In battle after battle, these soldiers proved that it wasn't the equipment they were given, but how they used it that made them formidable opponents. The Nazis, who had long held to their racial superiority, were forced to reckon with the skills and bravery of black soldiers. They were not merely facing inferior opponents, but soldiers who had mastered their craft despite the odds. The black soldiers of the 761st demonstrated that military technology, while important, could never replace the human spirit and ingenuity. In fact, their ability to overcome material limitations was a testament to their resilience. They fought with the knowledge that they had to prove their worth, not just to the Nazis, but to the very system that had attempted to deny them their rightful place in the military. This technological and material disadvantage only fueled their desire to win, to show that even with less they could achieve more. Each victory, whether it was against the German panzer divisions or in the streets of Nazi-held cities, was a demonstration of how skill, strategy, and sheer determination could overcome even the greatest technological challenges. Leadership in wartime is not only about directing troops in battle, it's about inspiring men to fight for something greater than themselves. For the 761st Tank Battalion, their leadership was crucial in shaping their success on the battlefield. Commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, who led the battalion with both military acumen and moral clarity, were essential in guiding these soldiers through some of the most harrowing battles of the war. The 761st's leadership was not just about military strategy, but about teaching the soldiers the importance of their mission. Bates, like many others in the battalion, understood the psychological weight of being a black soldier in World War II. The men of the 761st were not only fighting for their country and against the Nazis, but also for their recognition as equals in the military. In many ways, the leadership of the 761st was about instilling pride in their soldiers and showing them that they were as capable as any white soldier. This sense of pride was essential in the battles they fought. Bates and other leaders in the battalion made sure that their men knew that each victory, each successful mission was a victory not just for the 761st, but for all African American soldiers who had been denied the opportunity to prove themselves. Leadership also came from within the ranks. The black soldiers of the 761st led by example, demonstrating the courage, discipline, and tactical brilliance that would ultimately earn them the respect of their peers and superiors. As they advanced through Germany, their leadership was not just about commanding tanks. It was about showing the world and the Nazis that they were capable of far more than the military establishment had ever allowed them to demonstrate. This moral leadership was key to the battalion's effectiveness. It wasn't just about winning the war. It was about proving that these men, despite the odds stacked against them, were warriors and leaders in their own right. They demonstrated that leadership wasn't about race. It was about honor, courage, and the ability to inspire those around you. For the Nazis, witnessing the leadership of the 761st was an affront to their deeply ingrained beliefs about racial hierarchies. Here were soldiers, black soldiers, leading, fighting, and succeeding in ways that contradicted everything the Nazis had been taught to believe. The 761st's leadership, both on the battlefield and in terms of moral courage, was a powerful blow to the Nazi ideology of racial superiority. The 761st Tank Battalion was not only fighting for victory, it was fighting to show the world, through their leadership and actions, that African Americans were as capable of greatness as anyone else. In their leadership, both at the top and within the ranks, they proved this truth time and time again. The Nazis, faced with the advancing Allied forces, had long maintained an ideological stance of racial superiority. They viewed the African American soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion as a direct challenge to their beliefs. Under the influence of Nazi racial theories, the Germans saw themselves as the superior race, with a hierarchy that placed all other races beneath them. For the Nazis, the idea that black soldiers could stand as equals in combat was an affront to their entire worldview. The 761st, composed of men who had been subjected to racial prejudice in their own country, were now poised to directly challenge the Nazis' deeply ingrained notions of racial dominance. For the German soldiers, the sight of black soldiers in battle, fighting with the same determination, skill, and resolve as their white counterparts, was a psychological blow. The Nazis had been trained to believe in their inherent superiority, and they had seen black people as inferior for generations. The presence of black soldiers in the 761st Tank Battalion, however, demanded recognition. Their very existence contradicted everything the Nazis had been indoctrinated to believe about race and military capability. In this context, the 761st became more than just an opposing force. They became a symbol of the collapse of Nazi ideology. As the 761st soldiers advanced through Germany, the German soldiers who faced them were forced to grapple with the reality that their enemies were not the inferior beings they had been taught to fear. Instead, they were fighting against highly skilled, highly determined soldiers. Some German soldiers, in the face of this confrontation, may have even begun to question the racial superiority that had been instilled in them by the regime. The reality of the battlefield, where it was the 761st soldiers who were executing precision strikes and making tactical advancements, must have been a difficult one to reconcile with the racial beliefs that had been ingrained in the minds of many in the Wehrmacht. The 761st's reputation, earned through consistent success on the battlefield, carried with it an undeniable weight. The Nazis had to contend not only with the prowess of these soldiers, but with the psychological challenge that came with fighting an enemy they had been taught to regard as inferior. The very idea that black soldiers, whose very existence defied Nazi racial theories, could fight with such skill and bravery was a blow to the Nazis' pride, and likely sowed confusion and doubt among those who had believed in the twisted ideologies of their leadership. The act of black soldiers showing no mercy to the Nazis they faced in battle was deeply complex on a moral level. On one hand, it was a response to the atrocities committed by the Nazis, the systematic killing of millions of people, the oppression of entire races, and the crimes against humanity perpetrated by a regime that viewed its enemies as subhuman. In that context, the decision to show no mercy to the Nazis was, in some respects, a moral response to the dehumanization they had inflicted upon others. For the black soldiers, however, the act of showing no mercy carried an additional weight. They had fought for their own dignity and recognition in the face of a system that denied them both. The Nazis had not just been enemies on the battlefield, but symbolized the oppressive ideologies that had shaped the soldiers' lives back in the United States. The 761st soldiers were in many ways fighting a battle on two fronts, one against an external enemy and one against the institutional racism they had faced for their entire lives. Yet, despite the deep desire for revenge and the emotional weight of their struggle, the 761st soldiers were not consumed by hatred. They were soldiers, after all, and their objective was not merely to destroy the enemy but to uphold their own honor and dignity. The decision to show no mercy was rooted not just in vengeance, but in the desire to prove that they were more than just the oppressed. They were warriors with the same rights, responsibilities, and virtues as any other soldier. The 761st Tank Battalion did not allow themselves to be consumed by the ideology of racial hatred, even as they fought against a regime that had sought to degrade and destroy entire races. Their moral compass, shaped by the injustices they had experienced, was one of justice and honor rather than revenge. By showing no mercy to the Nazis, they were not acting out of blind anger, but out of a clear understanding that their fight was for something greater than themselves, something that transcended both race and revenge, humanity. In the end, the 761st soldiers proved that moral strength does not reside in denying one's enemies mercy, but in choosing to fight for what is just, even when the world around you is filled with hatred. Their actions in combat, while necessary for victory, also served as a reminder that the true victory lies not in destruction, but in the preservation of human dignity. By April 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion was entrenched in the heart of Germany, fighting with a relentless drive. The war was nearing its end, but the fighting was as intense as ever. The Nazis, though on the brink of collapse, were still clinging to the remnants of their power and pride. It was in the midst of this chaos, amidst the crumbling remains of the Nazi regime, that the 761st encountered a moment that would define not only their mission, but their entire existence as soldiers. On the battlefield, the Black Panthers advanced toward a heavily fortified German stronghold, a final bastion of Nazi resistance. The air was thick with tension. The 761st soldiers knew that this could be one of the final confrontations before the war came to an official close. It was here, in this charged atmosphere, that the moral complexities of their struggle would come to a head. The Nazis, having fought to uphold an ideology that viewed African Americans as subhuman, were about to face the very soldiers they had been taught to despise. As the battle unfolded, the 761st soldiers began to push forward with an intensity born of years of personal struggle. Every tank they maneuvered, every shell they fired was more than just military action. It was a statement. The enemy they faced was not just a force of soldiers. They represented the oppressive ideology that had long sought to degrade and oppress the men of the 761st, the black soldiers. understood the stakes of this battle, not only for the future of the world but for their own dignity. The Nazis were the physical manifestation of everything they had fought against, not just in Europe, but at home in America. When the 761st tanks made contact with the German forces, the intensity of the battle reached its peak. The Nazis, who had been taught to view the black soldiers as inferior and unworthy, now found themselves facing a highly skilled and determined force. The 761st tanks rumbled across the battlefield, their guns roaring with precision. The enemy soldiers, once convinced that they had the upper hand, were now confronted with the relentless power of these black soldiers. For the 761st, this was more than just a military victory. It was an emotional reckoning, a moment when they could prove once and for all that their worth was not defined by the color of their skin, but by their skill, their valor, and their moral integrity. They showed no mercy to the Nazis, not out of hate, but out of the necessity of justice. The Nazis, who had once fought to impose their racial beliefs on the world, were now on the receiving end of the very ideals they had sought to destroy. The black soldiers fought with a sense of moral righteousness, their actions not just military but deeply personal. Every shell fired, every Nazi stronghold taken, was a step toward reclaiming the dignity they had long been denied. As the battle reached its climax, the 761st soldiers emerged victorious. The German forces were shattered, their resistance crumbling under the relentless onslaught of the Black Panthers. In that moment, the Nazis, who had once viewed their enemies as inferior, had no choice but to confront the undeniable truth. The black soldiers were not only equal to their white counterparts, they were, in many ways, their superior. This battle marked the end of an era for the 761st Tank Battalion. It was a moment of closure, a moment when the soldiers could finally see the fruits of their sacrifices. The victory was not just over the Nazis, it was a victory over the racial prejudice that had plagued their own lives. They had fought for a world of freedom and equality, and in this battle, they had won more than just military supremacy. They had reclaimed their humanity. The aftermath of the battle was a mixture of triumph and reflection. The 761st Tank Battalion had delivered a devastating blow to the Nazi forces, but for many of the soldiers, the emotional impact of the victory was just as significant as the military one. The act of showing no mercy to the Nazis was not just a form of retribution, it was an expression of the soldiers' long-buried frustrations and anger. For the men of the 761st, the victory was more than a strategic win, it was a personal one. They had been fighting for equality, for recognition, for the right to be seen as equals in a world that had denied them that right for so long. In this final confrontation with the Nazis, they had the chance to fight not only for their country but for themselves. As black soldiers in a segregated military, they had always had to prove their worth. But now, on the battlefield in Germany, they had the opportunity to show that their value was not defined by their race but by their actions, their courage, and their skill. As they surveyed the aftermath of the battle, there was a sense of solemn pride. They had emerged victorious, but they knew that the fight for equality and recognition was far from over. The war was ending, but the racial struggles that had defined much of their lives would continue. Yet in this moment they had proved something far more important than military superiority. They had proved that, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, they could rise above the prejudices of their time and show the world their true strength. The victory was not just military, it was moral, emotional, and for many of the 761st soldiers, a defining moment in their journey toward equality. They had fought for freedom, and in doing so, they had redefined what it meant to be a soldier and a man. With the 761st Tank Battalion's victory over the Nazis in April 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. The Nazi regime was collapsing under the weight of Allied forces, and within weeks Germany would surrender, marking the end of the war in Europe. The 761st had played a pivotal role in this victory, fighting tirelessly to liberate territories and defeat the forces of oppression. But for these soldiers, the victory was not just a matter of military conquest. It was a personal triumph over the racial prejudice and discrimination they had faced throughout their lives in the immediate aftermath of their success on the battlefield. The black soldiers of the 761st found themselves in a bittersweet position. They had fought for their country, for the freedom of others, and for recognition within their own military. But while they were celebrated as heroes abroad, their return to the United States was far from the welcome they deserved. African American soldiers, despite their invaluable contributions to the war effort, were still subject to the same segregation, discrimination, and systemic racism that had marked their lives before the war. The irony of this situation was not lost on the soldiers. They had fought valiantly for a country that had denied them equal rights, and now, having proved their worth on the battlefield, they were still treated as second-class citizens at home. Despite the 761st's undeniable success in Europe, their valor was often overshadowed by the racial prejudices that continued to permeate American society. The soldiers' return to the U.S. was met with a muted recognition, and many of them faced the stark reality that their battle for equality had not yet been won. The emotional and psychological impact of this reality was profound. For the soldiers of the 761st, the victory in Germany was a moment of pride, but it also highlighted the deep-rooted injustices that still existed in the United States. They had fought against the Nazis, whose ideology had been based on racial hatred, only to return home and face a system that still saw them as inferior. The dissonance between their role in the war and the treatment they received upon their return was a painful reminder of the struggle for equality that was far from over. Yet, despite these challenges, the legacy of the 761st would continue to inspire future generations of African American soldiers and activists. Their victory in Europe was not just a military one. It was a moral victory that would become an important chapter in the broader fight for civil rights in the United States. The bravery and resilience of the 761st served as a beacon of hope for those who continued to fight for racial equality in the post-war world. In the years that followed, the 761st would receive recognition for their service, though it came much later than it should have. They were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2015, long after many of the battalion's veterans had passed. The delay in this recognition reflected the broader struggle that African American soldiers faced in having their contributions fully acknowledged. However, the 761st's bravery and sacrifices were not forgotten. The impact of their actions on the battlefield, and the broader implications of their struggle for equality, remains a testament to their courage and moral strength. The experience of the 761st Tank Battalion in World War II highlighted the profound contradictions at the heart of American society during the war. On one hand, the United States fought to protect the ideals of freedom and democracy abroad. On the other, African Americans were still fighting for those very same ideals at home. The 761st soldiers, despite their undeniable contributions to the war effort, were not allowed to fully enjoy the freedoms they were fighting to protect. In Germany, the 761st soldiers confronted not only the Nazis, but also the racial ideologies that had been imposed on them by their own country. They fought against a regime that viewed them as inferior, only to return home and face similar prejudices from their fellow Americans. The war, for these soldiers, was as much about proving their worth in battle as it was about fighting for the recognition they were denied in their own land. In the post-war years, the 761st's role in World War II would become an important catalyst for the civil rights movement. While the 761st soldiers did not experience the full extent of recognition and equality they deserved immediately after the war, their service helped pave the way for future generations of African Americans to challenge the racial barriers that had long defined American life. The soldiers' bravery in battle and their resilience in the face of racism inspired many to continue the fight for equality, culminating in the social and political movements that would reshape the nation in the years that followed. The moral and emotional challenges faced by the 761st soldiers were significant, but their victories, both on the battlefield and in the fight for their own dignity, laid the foundation for a new chapter in American history. Their actions in Europe demonstrated that, even in the face of racial prejudice, African American soldiers could rise to the occasion and fight not only for victory but for their own place in history. The 761st story serves as a reminder of the complexity of the African American experience during World War II. It was a time when the battle for freedom was not just fought against foreign enemies, but against the deeply ingrained racial inequalities that existed at home. The courage of the 761st and their refusal to be defined by the prejudices of both their enemies and their own nation stands as a powerful testament to their strength, resilience, and commitment to the ideals of justice and equality. As the war ended and the 761st Tank Battalion returned home, their victory in Germany was celebrated in certain military circles but largely overlooked by the American public. Despite their unparalleled bravery and key role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, the black soldiers of the 761st were met with the harsh reality of racial segregation that still permeated the United States. Their service was not immediately recognized as it should have been, and the same country they fought to liberate was still one that denied them equal rights and dignity. Their return to America was, in many ways, a bittersweet conclusion to a journey that had started in a world filled with racial prejudice and discrimination. But the legacy of the 761st is profound. Their fight against the Nazis, while a battle for victory on the front lines, was also a struggle for recognition and equality. For these soldiers, the battlefield was not just a place to prove their military prowess. It was where they demonstrated their moral strength, their ability to rise above the dehumanizing forces of prejudice that sought to define them. The battle against the Nazis was also, in a sense, a fight against the very racism they faced at home. When they showed no mercy to the enemy, who shared similar ideologies of racial superiority, they were not only fighting for the future of the world but for their own dignity and humanity. The 761st soldiers proved that their worth could not be determined by the color of their skin or the racial prejudices of the society they came from. They proved that, in the face of hatred and oppression, it was possible to show compassion, to fight for justice, and to maintain the integrity of one's character. Their actions in Europe symbolized more than just military victories. They symbolized a broader moral victory in the struggle for human dignity. Though they returned home to a nation that still struggled with racial inequality, the courage of the 761st Tank Battalion was not forgotten. It would inspire future generations in the civil rights movement and beyond. The 761st story stands as a reminder that the true fight for freedom is not only fought on battlefields but in the hearts and minds of those who refuse to be defined by the prejudices of the world around them. In the end, the 761st soldiers did not just fight for victory. They fought for the recognition of their worth as human beings, equal to anyone else. And though the war was over, their fight for equality would continue, echoing in the decades to come as part of the ongoing struggle for justice in the United States.